The Second Civil War, 1940. One of the widespread consequences of this war is the growing determination among colonial, subject, and minority peoples everywhere to win for themselves a share of the freedom for which all allied nations are fighting. This is the great quest of our time. To future historians, it may well overshadow all other aspects of the present conflict. We as Americans cannot be on one side abroad and on another side at home. We cannot expect small nations and men of other races and colors to credit the good faith of our professed purposes and to join us in international collaboration for future peace if we continue to practice an ugly discrimination at home against our own minorities, the largest of which is our 13 million Negro citizens. The list of grievances of the Negro people is a long one. Not only is the Negro in many parts of the country denied his legal rights in violation of the Constitution, but he is denied the substance of freedom and opportunity in such matters as equal education, equal chance for economic advancement, and his just share of public services such as playgrounds, hospitals, and community provisions for health and welfare of all kinds. He is systematically housed in the worst sections of our large cities, and for his poor housing, frequently charged exorbitant rents. He is traditionally the last hired and the first fired. He is often denied protection under the law. But of all the indignities and injustices Negro men and women suffer today, the most bitter and ironic is the discrimination and the mistreatment they have received in the armed forces of their country, the country for which they are asked to give their lives. In short, the Negro lives in our midst under the discriminations which differ from the racial discrimination practiced by Nazis, only in that ours is illegal and that we are free if we wish to fight against them. The deep patience of the colored people is nearing its end. The war has pointed the issues out for them. They feel, and who can deny, that they have the right. If they have the right to die with their fellow white citizens in the protection of liberty, then they also should have the right to live with them in the enjoyment of that liberty. We have granted them the first right. It is our obligation to see that they get the second. The most effective means at hand towards that end is political, effective as a bargaining point for the Negro, whose vote at the moment is sought by both parties, and effective as an instrument of justice in the hands of all Americans who desire to redress the wrongs of which most Americans are ashamed. Wendell L. Willkie, 1940, Republican presidential candidate. 1948. I am haunted by a single grim fact pulled out of dry statistics as I prepared an address some months back. It is in the fact that a Negro child born this day has a life expectancy 10 years less than that of a white child born just a few miles away. I say that these 10 years, those extra 10 years, are what we are fighting for. I say that those who stand in the way of the health, education, housing, and Social Security programs which would erase that gap commit murder. I say that those who perpetuate Jim Crow are criminal. I pledge to you that I shall fight them with everything that I have. Vice President of the United States, Henry A. Wallace, Progressive Party candidate for president, 1948. 1998. Vice President Al Gore, speaking to an NAACP convention, said, "There's a widespread disparity between blacks and whites in health, wealth, and education statistics." These people who now call for an end of politics to promote equal opportunity say that there has been so much progress that no more efforts are justified. What are they thinking? Don't they realize that the taproot of racism is hundreds of years long? July 16th, 1998. Chapter 1. Reflection. Leroy Jerome Moton was born on May the 5th, 1945 in Selma, Alabama. He was 9 years old when the Supreme Court of the United States ruled that separate but equal school systems were contrary to the Constitution. On May 25th, 1975, while facing an overdressed, light-skinned African-American social worker at McCook County Hospital in Hartford, Connecticut, where Leroy was a patient, I felt a sickening, painful, familiar sense of defeat pass over me. It was Leroy that should have received those 10 extra years that Henry Wallace spoke of. It was Leroy that Wendell Willkie promised to help if black people would only vote for him. It was Leroy who Vice President Gore was speaking about when he mentioned disparities between the races. But in 1975, Leroy lived in a ghetto in the North. His first child had to survive on a diet dictated by the size of the welfare check. He watched the northern schools getting blacker, the suburbs getting whiter. He heard all the speeches of the nationalists, the integrationists, the liberals, and the racists. He had marched, been beaten, tear-gassed, and jailed. He looked at me with those pleading, non-smiling eyes and asked, "Tell me, who is the enemy, Dave? How do I beat him?" At that moment, I realized that white America had, as Henry Wallace said, committed murder. It looked to me at that time that Leroy was not going to get those 10 extra years, and perhaps his child wouldn't either. Today, Leroy is a wounded veteran of the Second Civil War and left with flashbacks, memories of that horrible night after the Second Battle of Selma had ended, and he sat next to the bleeding, dying body of Viola Liuzzo. Chapter 2, The Beginning. Oh, how I remember that fabulous day in our history. It was so hot in the nation's capital that many of us sat, cooling our feet in the reflecting pool while we listened to Martin Luther King deliver his historic "I Have a Dream" speech. It was August 28, 1963. An appeal to you from Mathram Abram, Johann Prince, Eugene Carlson Blake, Philip Randolph, James Farmer, Walter Reuter, Roy Wilkins, Martin Luther King Jr., Whitney Young, and John Lewis invite you to march on Washington. America faces a crisis. Millions of Negroes are denied freedom. Millions of citizens, black and white, are unemployed. We demand meaningful civil rights laws, massive federal works programs, full and fair employment, the right to vote, adequate integrated education, decent housing. In your community, groups are mobilizing for this march. You can get information on how to get to Washington by calling civil rights organizations, religious organizations, trade unions, and fraternal organizations and youth groups. Please march on Washington for jobs and freedom. 170 West 130th Street, New York. Cleveland Robinson, Boehner Rustin, Deputy Director, the March on Washington. I tried to control my excitement. Remember, I told myself, the grassroots fires that you were going to help start with the Progressive Party back in 1948? Remember how positive about it all you were then? The second war to end all wars had been won again, and now you had a real leader, the ex-Vice President of the United States, Henry Wallace. You were so sure that legal segregation would be ended that year, and that America was going to be a true democracy for all of its people. It was difficult to keep things in perspective. The momentum created by Henry Wallace died before the 1948 elections were over, and here we were for 15 years trying to revive it. With the hot sun beating down and my legs still aching from the long bus ride and the march to the Lincoln Memorial, I should have been content to just sit in the shade with my feet in the water and listen to the speeches. But I couldn't. I gave up my prized seat and continued to walk around and just feel the vibrations. I told myself over and over not to get so damn emotional, but for me it was such a rare occasion. I was welcome, and I felt safe in the middle of this herd. No longer was I a wild-eyed dreamer or a person on the political fringe. This was real. There were over 200,000 people there, including many famous ones, black and white. It was one of the most emotional experiences of my life. Nothing like it had ever happened in America before. They threw rocks at us in Peekskill, New York, tear-gassed us in Newark, vicious dogs in Birmingham, Alabama. But that beautiful day when America stopped to listen was a high test refueling for all those striving to bring true equality to our land. I must admit that there were moments when I lost it. I had to force back tears at times. I felt like a GI in World War II, when toward the end of the war one could look out on the sea and watch the huge convoys stretching clear to the horizon, bringing fresh troops and supplies. You knew the war wasn't over, but you sure as hell felt unbeatable. That's how I felt that steamy day in August. I was unbeatable, and together we were going to crush the enemy. Chapter 3, Tape 1, Part 1, March 14th, 1965, Brown Chapel AME Church, Selma, Alabama. This tape is hardly audible, but I can remember the smells and the taste of that pan of delicious fried chicken and cornbread that we shared while we made it. It was recorded in Brown's Chapel in Selma, Alabama. I didn't date it, but it must have been 2 nights before the Selma to Montgomery March began on March 16th, 1965. The heavy-set, always smiling local woman who donated the food told us that her son was going to be drafted, and she laughed and said, "He's going to fight for free elections." As I said, the tape is in poor condition, but I can hear the Delta accent and the positive, confident voice of Leroy responding to my questions about where he was that joyous day in 1963. I was in school, and one of my teachers say, "Leroy, what does this day mean to you?" I remember that I couldn't think of an answer, so I say as I felt. I was excited, so I say, "Well, I hope that it means something to everybody in America." I tell you, peoples in Selma were so happy. I don't think that anyone could answer that question right off. We were all watching television, and we could see it, but it was hard for most of us to believe it. I don't know. It made me feel like the peoples all over weren't like they were in Selma. I mean, the white people. There were all them big stars, not just Negro stars, but white ones too. All them people, man, I never seen so many people. All there for the Civil Rights Bill. I can imagine how you felt, Leroy, because I was there, and I was finding it all hard to believe too. Hell, I didn't even bother to listen to most of the speeches. Of course, I heard King's dream speech, but most of the time, I just walked around looking at the faces. They came from all over, the suburbs, cities, and farms. Sometimes I felt like shouting, "Where the hell have all you people been for the last 15 years? But it was so great to see them all there that you just couldn't think of yesterdays or failure. Hell, yesterdays didn't exist. There were over 200,000 people being watched by the whole world, and they were demanding an end to segregation, equal rights under the law, and equal representation. There was only tomorrow to think about. And with that army, I thought, what a tomorrow it was going to be. I never told Leroy that when I left Washington on the bus, I knew I had to go straight to work. The bus arrived back in town around daybreak, allowing me just enough time to take a shower, change my clothes, and head for the office. I was reading the paper and sipping coffee when my secretary came into the room. The television station where we worked carried long news clips of the march, and she watched most of it, knowing that I was there. "Hey, I saw you on camera, really," she said before sitting down at her desk. "They even zoomed right in on you because you were with a bunch of Negro kids from Mississippi." Yes, I was. I don't know how I got in with them, but I was just drifting around and I loved their singing, so I stayed with them. It was beautiful. I never experienced such a feeling in my whole life. One soul, one heart, one thought, all in 200,000 bodies. It was so exciting. Listen to you. I think you're delirious. You should have gone home to bed. Are you kidding? Who could sleep? I want to read everything about it. I want to hear what people are saying. I want to know how America is going to feed off of this event. She put her coffee cup down and stared at me. "Dave, I'm a little worried about you." "Why?" "Well, I think you're making too much out of this. God will decide when. How many people in that crowd were there just to get on TV? How many northern politicians with many Negro constituents had to be there? I mean, in reality, it didn't mean that the world was going to change tomorrow." "No, of course not, but the point is that the fear has been put aside. There's unity. There's a direction, a political direction. Momentum has been created." "I still say that you're making too much of it. Look, we better get back to work. I have these merchandising reports. I have to get them out today." "No, wait," I said, noticing a strange expression on her beautiful young face. "Something's bothering you. What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong, really. Well, you know me. I'm not a racist. But, well, I don't know if I can explain it. When I get married and have children, I would want them to go to the same school and the same church that I went to. I was a cheerleader, and my school was integrated, and it was very nice. Now the Negro kids say filthy things to the white girls, and there's a lot of bad language in the school. I wouldn't want my kids going to that school, would you? When my youth class at church talks about these things, I can see the resentment and hatred that was never there before begin to build, and I get scared. Maybe you're pushing things too hard. The masturbation was over, and I tried to cling to the ecstasy too long. The result was the inevitable feeling of fatigue, disgust, disillusionment, and loneliness. In an attempt to recapture a tiny portion of the felicity that blanketed us all on the bus back, I forced myself to reread some of King's speech from the morning paper. Quotes, "But there is something that I must say to my people who stand on the threshold which leads into the palace of justice. In the process of gaining our rightful place, we must not be guilty of wrongful deeds. Let us not satisfy our thirst for freedom by drinking from the cup of bitterness and hatred. We must forever conduct our struggles on the high plane of dignity and discipline. We must not allow our creative protest to disintegrate into physical violence. Again and again, we must rise to the majestic heights of meeting physical force with soul force. The marvelous new militancy which has engulfed the Negro community must not lead to a distrust of all white people. For many of our white brothers, as evidenced by their presence here today, have come to realize that their destiny is tied up with our destiny, and their freedom is inextricably bound to our freedom. We cannot walk alone." "I guess you're right," I sighed. "I should have gone to bed. Tell anyone that asks that I went to a meeting downstate. You can reach me at home." At home, I lay on top of the bed without undressing or pulling the covers down. I knew that there had to be a real meaning for me in the Great March. The speeches were not for me. John Lewis's demand for freedom now, King's sermon, Rabbi Prince's lectures were all meant for the press and the television audiences. But what we really were there for was to give ourselves an ultimatum. It was too late to give in to the balm of causism. It was too late to sniff the intellectuals' cocaine of speaking at each other. In the age of high-tech weaponry, it would be senseless to fall for the provocateur's trick of engaging us into one of the most disastrous mistakes of buying guns. It was time to try and deal with the enemy and deal him a fatal blow. It was time to hit the real enemy, the one that controls my secretary's heart and mind. I must devote full time to undo the brainwashing and reach out for the young minds. In the afternoon, I promised myself I would call my Quaker friend and ask him if the job at the American Friends Services Committee was still open. I must stop living this schizoid existence with one leg in the advertising world and the other in the world of love. Tomorrow, I shall jump with both feet back into the struggle for human dignity. Chapter 4. Gary Thomas Rowe, Jr., a longtime FBI paid informant, led a group of thugs carrying a weighted baseball bat in the beatings of the 1961 freedom fighters. He said he had notified the FBI of what was going to happen, but they took no action. He was later indicted for the murder of Viola Liuzzo, along with 3 other Klan members. He was in the murder car. If the FBI knew how dangerous these men in the car were, and that they were probably armed, why weren't they keeping that car under surveillance? If they had, perhaps Viola Liuzzo would be playing with her grandchildren today. I jumped all right, but I didn't know how far, or where I was going to land. When I got the notice from Dr. King's Southern Christian Leadership Conference, I decided to put body and soul into the movement. We were all a bit apprehensive when our plane first landed at the airport that services Selma, Alabama. I, for one, didn't know how we were going to be received, or how I personally would fit in to the movement. I wondered if I would know anyone there. Now I feel very inadequate when trying to describe the soul-stirring ebullience that seemed to engulf the old bus that took us from the airport to Selma. The bus stopped in the midst of a cheering crowd right in front of Brown's Chapel. "What did you say? I can't hear you," I shouted to the man standing right next to me. "I said, isn't this exciting?" he said. I didn't bother to answer because it was my turn to step down off the bus. The crowd was cheering and started another chorus of "Oh, Freedom." My fingers tingled and my legs felt weak. I didn't know if it was from the long plane ride or trying to propel myself through the unbelievably charged Selma air. The singing, the clapping, the laughing, and yes, for some, the weeping in that large crowd that turned out to greet us put a lump in my throat and tears in my eyes. "Hey, Truskoff, up here!" I heard someone yell. I looked up, and standing on the top of the stairs that led into Brown's Chapel were two old friends from my broadcasting days in Ohio. I hadn't seen them in years, but hugging them when I got to the top of the stairs made me feel certain that I had done the right thing when I decided to come to Selma. We were at that moment when Russia and the American troops met at the Elbe River. Oh yes, this time we will gain the ultimate victory. I was still trying to brush the tears from my eyes as they led me into the church. "Come on, man, we'll get you something to eat. Grab a tray and I'll get you a food card. The people of this town have been so great. This ain't Columbus, Ohio, David. These people really have the spirit. There is such unity. Women have been cooking all night and baking bread and making coffee. They've opened up their homes. In one case, we found an older couple that had moved in with their daughter, and they were sleeping on the floor just so staff people could get some rest in their beds. Of course, we moved them back, but that shows you what the spirit is like here." All I could do was smile at their enthusiasm. I felt it penetrating my every pore. I remembered when the man sitting next to me was a lonely, out-of-work black musician from Ohio. He used to call my show all the time and ask me to play Billie Holiday records until he himself became a nighttime disc jockey at the station, and we developed a real friendship. "How many people do you think are here?" I asked. "Hell, I don't know. They're pouring in so fast. They'll be coming in all week. I guess no one expected this many. I think your group must be the biggest. Did you ride that old bus all the way down here?" "Oh no, we flew." "That whole gang? How many are there?" About 90, I think. The plane was chartered, and we each only had to pay 100. The quiet in the room suddenly made me realize how many people were listening to our conversation. A heavy-set black man with a full beard lifted his coffee cup. "Did you hear that?" he asked in a voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "That's $9,000. That's more than my whole yearly budget in Mississippi. I'll bet that bus was full of ministers." I felt that I had to respond. "Yes," I said, "there were many ministers on the plane, and I don't give a damn about anyone's motives. All I know is that this was one way to show their support. It also gave them a rare opportunity to take a stand and to show the people of their own community where they stood. Don't mock them, man." The large man smiled at me. "Don't get defensive. I was just thinking that there must be groups back there in Connecticut that could use that $9,000. I'm sure that there must be a SNCC group that would just love to have it. I understand that you are all going back in just a few hours. It sure didn't do us much good to give all that money to the airlines just so a few preachers can tell their flocks that they've been to Selma." My food suddenly became very tasteless. I remember the party-like atmosphere at the church in Hartford before we left. Two of my daughters sang, "Going to Selma with my mind set on freedom." Ministers shook each other's hands, and the photographers took pictures for the evening TV shows and the morning papers. One sad-eyed, bearded man who had come down from Harvard University told the group that he was not going because he felt that the people in Selma were no worse off than black people in Hartford. "At least they have an enemy that will stand up in front of you and fight. Here we have enemies that will spend their money for a plane ride to get their picture in the paper, while the cops here beat us on the head." The minister in charge of the trip told the press that the man was unbalanced and that they should pay no attention to him. They didn't. I looked around the small room at the back of Brown's Chapel before I turned and spoke. Maybe part of what he said was true, but I'm not going back. I'm going all the way. "Look, man," rumbled a huge man seated at the end of our table. "Don't pay him no mind. He didn't see what happened to those kids out there when the bus arrived. All them people from the north came all the way down here to tell them that they doing the right thing. I say that's worth the $9,000. You all go out there and take another look at those kids." My friends nodded and smiled before taking my empty plates and leading me back out into the electrified air. The hours whizzed by, interrupted frequently by emotional reunions. I met people that I knew from New Jersey and New York, and even as far away as California. People spun me around, pumped my hand, kissed my cheek. I didn't even have time to say goodbye to those returning to Hartford. Instead, I went directly to a meeting at the First Baptist Church. There I listened as teenagers gave us a lecture on what the nonviolent movement was all about. If you can't be nonviolent, "You're a danger to all of us," said one young man. Another gave an illustration of how to act when under a tear gas attack and how to assume the nonviolent position when the police acted violently. I remember thinking to myself on the way back to Brown Chapel, all right, damn it, don't do it again. Even if we do defy Governor Wallace and march all the way to Montgomery, so what? But the people kept coming in from all over the country, and donations of food, clothing, and money were pouring in. Celebrities were beginning to arrive, and I couldn't fight that old feeling. This was not a bunch of intellectuals in a stadium in New Jersey. There was no obscene gesture by thousands of good guys in the nation's capital. This was really a movement rocketing on high explosive youth power right into the heart of Dixie. No one could stop it or reroute it. No one could deter it. No, sir. This rocket was going to explode right in the face of redneck America. Oh, yes. This was reality. I tugged on the arm of my friend from Ohio sitting next to me, and I asked, I have to get to a bank and buy some traveler's checks. Can you tell me where it is? Whatever you do, do not go alone. Come to Brown Chapel about 8 in the morning, and you'll find a tall, thin kid. You can't miss him. Everybody around here knows him. Just ask anybody, and they'll point him out to you. His name's Leroy Moten. He'll get somebody to drive you. Chapter 5. On March 9, 1965, 1 week before the historic Selma to Montgomery March began, the Reverend James J. Reeb, a white Unitarian minister from Boston, was attacked and killed by 4 racist thugs. The killers were arrested, but not convicted. The young woman that Leroy pointed to early the next morning was only 15, but quite tall for her age. She didn't seem upset at all about the idea of showing me the way to the bank. I asked her how far it was. It's just down the road a ways, she answered, keeping her huge brown eyes focused on my shoes. Down in town, I asked. Yes, sir, she said before grimacing. What's the matter? Sir, will you do something for me? Of course, what is it? Well, every time I say yes, sir, will you slap my wrist or something? I'm trying to stop saying it. The kids from the north all make fun of me. I only say it to white people. I bent down to meet her eyes with mine. Don't you let that bother you. You young ones here are the leaders. You're doing something that they should have done long ago, and they know it. They don't mean to make fun of you. They admire you. I work for these white folk, and I say it so much that it's just a habit. I tried to make her feel better by telling her that millions of people say yes sir to their boss or to a policeman. There was nothing wrong with that. For the first time, she looked up at me and smiled. Let's go, she said. We walked down the street together, past Brown Chapel, and toward the police barricade at the end of the street. Will they let us through there, I asked. Oh, sure. This is a public street. They might stop us, but I think they'll let us go. They're supposed to be protecting us from the Klan riding through, and they also supposed to be stopping any marchers from going out. But today, we going anyhow. Just as we approached the corner, 2 policemen, or perhaps they were state troopers, stepped quickly from the trailer, parked at the curb. One pointed a camera and continued to walk toward us. I was amazed to see the teenage girl skip up to him and point her hip at the camera. Where are you going? The officer asked. To the bank, I replied through clenched teeth. I felt insulted by the cameraman and degraded by having to answer the question. I'm sorry, but I can't find the young woman's name anywhere in my notes, but I'll never forget her. She made the entire march to Montgomery and with her beautiful voice, who often led the singing. She sang solos in her church choir, but it was her courage that I admired. Aren't you afraid? I asked her. Doesn't it worry you that when the press and all the white people are gone, that the whites here are going to make trouble for you? Don't you worry about going back to school? Yes, sir, sometimes I do. But here, I gotta tell you something. About a month ago, them white kids raped a girl from our school. She died. Our people found that white boy's car, and it even had some of her clothing in it. But that sheriff, he don't do nothing. Why should I worry about going to school when they doing that? I might never go back to school, unless I go to Parrish. That's the white school. When we first left the police barricade, she did a very unusual thing. She took my hand and led me away from there. But as we turned the corner, she let go of my hand. When we got towards the center of the next block, she quickened her pace so much that she was walking way out in front of me. A white sedan with about 4 men in it went by very slowly. I tried to keep my eyes straight ahead and pretended not to notice. She glanced back and forced a smile. I thought maybe they was FBI or something. Now I don't think so. They turned around and is following us. They may be mad 'cause you walking with me. It may be some of them white boys from Paris that always trying to get me to go for a ride in their car. I know what they want to take me for and why. My mother worked for his family. She glanced back again. No, it ain't them. I'll go ahead. I don't think they'll bother you. The bank is just 3 blocks down and 1 block to the right. You can't miss it. She began walking faster and faster ahead of me. She turned down the next block. The car was now crawling just behind me. I turned down the same street. I glanced back and I saw the back door of the car thrown open. I looked back and saw her waving to me and running up a driveway. I ran back towards her and followed her through the yards all the way back to the George Washington Carver Housing Project. 2 policemen standing in front of the squad car started to come towards us, but we walked right on by and into Brown Chapel. Inside I was breathing rather heavily, and I sat down next to her. This time her smile was not forced, and it led to a short giggle. "Afraid?" she asked. "Yes, of course. Who were they?" "I don't know, but I didn't want to wait to find out. I'm sorry. I should have known better. I should have waited until somebody could take you over in a car. I'll get you some coffee." The tall, muscular, bearded man who spoke that first night in Brown Chapel about the effect that our arrival had had on the youth in Selma came out of the kitchen. "What's this I hear about you being chased?" He stood over me with a large wooden cross swinging freely from the leather thong around his neck. Sheepishly and briefly, I related the story, realizing how foolish I had been, not only risking my safety, but the safety of that lovely girl. "Well, Bwana," he said with a smile, "welcome to America's Southland. You keep trying and you're going to save us darkies yet, if you don't get yourself killed first." That afternoon, I heard of the brutal slaying of Reverend Reeb from Boston. The Civil Rights Act of 1960 provided for court-appointed referees to register voters in places where discrimination was found. Viola Liuzzo smiled at me as she pushed her way through the crackling air. The cheering seemed to lift her right off her feet. She had just presented a check to Dr. King, and the roar of appreciation from those crowded into Brown Chapel could be heard in downtown Selma. This is Chapter 6. Mr. Bonner brought his 2 hands together as his shoulders bounced up and down with laughter. We had just finished our thick cuts of bacon, grits, eggs, and coffee with homemade bread, and we were planning our day. I stayed with the Bonners the few nights that I spent in Selma prior to the march. The soft, deep-throated laughter that bubbled over his protruding tongue was so infectious that all 4 of us seated at the table began to laugh. He clapped his hands together as he continued his story. "The last time that I went to register, they said that there was some discrepancy about my age. I showed them the paper. I was born 70 years ago right here in this county. Now, I ain't worked for but 2 people in my whole life. The last man I worked for him for 40 years. They's also right here in the county." Mr. Bonner's shoulders again shook as he burst into a loud laughter. He snatched a piece of paper off the table and thrust it at me. "Look here, they reject me because they say there's a discrepancy about how long I've been a resident." We all laughed, but the laughter from the other white guests and I was forced. The matter wasn't to be laughed at. Mr. Bonner sensed our discomfort, and as the room grew quiet, he looked down at the table. "Don't you worry. I'm going back today. I'm going to register. I can promise you that. Those kids keep coming over here and saying, 'Mr. Bonner, we're going to do it today.' If those kids ain't afraid, why should I be? My family's all grown. I got grandchildren and all. These young peoples have their whole life to risk out there, marching and carrying peoples to register. It's a shame that some of us older folk don't help them more. But we want you peoples to know we appreciate you leaving your houses and coming down here. And you just tell us if there's something that you need, more blankets or something. You get hungry or something, you tell us. You hear?" I heard, and I knew exactly how the students in that bus that Leroy described felt after the farmer had talked to them. I thought of my family back home and what they must think of their father leaving them to go to Selma. I wondered if they understood that what I was doing for them, for their America. Hurrying across the ball field to a meeting at Brown Chapel, the fatigue and the aches that I felt earlier after trying to sleep on a mattress on the floor vanished the way the butterflies or nervousness vanish after the kickoff in a football game. Bonner's words stayed with me. For the first time, I felt that I was involved in a history-making event. This was the birth of a real, unstoppable movement. It was obvious that the young black students had complete control of it. They knew they were the fuel that made the engine go. The rest of us were being used to deflect the violence. The local police could get away with beating black children, but they feared having one of the networks show the beating of a white adult. The murder of Reverend Reeb brought the shower of new donations and an outrage of the entire religious community. Busloads of seminarians and other students began to arrive after they had heard of his death. The evening meetings at Brown Chapel were packed with bursting energy and excitement. The singing brought emotions to the peak of human endurance. The special meeting that morning was brief. Tactics for a demonstration at Mayor Smitherton's house were discussed. The state police were manning the barricades at both intersections, leading in and out of our area, making it impossible for any large groups to leave en masse. It was decided that almost all the cars in the motor pool would be dispersed at various locations in the vicinity of the housing project. At a given time, each would load with 4 passengers and leave at different intervals, telling anyone who would ask that they were going to the airport or the bus terminal. Each auto would ride around until the specified time and then take a different route to the mayor's house. The trick was to all arrive at the destination at the same time. It was a maneuver that we used to get the families that needed housing and to City Hall back in Waterbury years later. It all worked very well, but of course the police were watching all of our cars, and they arrived almost at the same time. I stepped from our automobile just in time to see a white man rush up to a terrified young demonstrator from the University of Michigan. She pointed a revolver at his stomach, and she spat on him. A local policeman spoke to her, but ignoring him, she shouted at the boy, "You nigger-loving son of a bitch! Why don't you go back where you came from instead of making trouble here?" I could plainly see the insane rage in her eyes, and I was sure that she was going to pull the trigger. "There's sick people here," she screamed. "They need rest. Can't you see the no noise sign? The mayor is not well." A policeman who knew her name and talked her into giving the gun to him led her away across the street while she still shouted her epithets, while the shaken young man was immediately arrested. I joined the line and tried to sing as much on key as one can while staring at hard hats and billy clubs. I could hear some of the local kids, including Sweetness, giggle as they switched to the song, "Sick people need you here, kumbaya." None of us believed the mayor was sick. The arrests were rather routine and relatively nonviolent, although one seminarian was hit in the nose and was bleeding profusely as he was pushed into a small police van. The police were trying to get him in before any photographer could get a shot of him. The arrival of the news crew and the television cameras spared a few heads. One youth, obviously a new arrival from the north, made the mistake of trying to sit in the front seat of the police car when he saw how crowded the back already was. The driver picked up a cattle prod and started to swing it at him. But Alabama Safety Director Wilson Baker, seeing a news camera pointed at the scene, shouted, "No, don't hit him." And he yanked the man back and pushed him onto the floor in the back seat. He twisted the man's legs up into my lap to get him in. The press was barred from entering the area by local sheriff's deputies and posse men as we were lined up and forced to stand silently in the police station courtyard for what seemed like hours before Sheriff Wilson Baker decided to march us into the recreation hall for black residents. There was obviously not enough jail space for all of us. We started to file in when a nervous clergyman asked in a loud stage whisper, "What happens now?" The little girl who answered could not have been more than 12 years old. She wore a white raincoat covered with slogans and signatures from demonstrators from all over the country. Her high, squeaky voice brought laughter to all of us and lessened the tension. "I'll tell you what they're going to do. They're going to send me home, and they're going to send you to jail." Sure enough, we were made to walk in single file, and just as she was about to enter the building, a policeman pulled her out of the line and said, "Your mama going to whip you good this time." Wilson Baker, the local safety commissioner, came in late that night to announce that he was going to escort us safely back to the Negro district. A group of ministers that had been arrested the day before decided to sit in and demand an apology for the unwarranted arrests. We decided to do the same, but a handful of us had to get back to Brown Chapel because we were security guards for the march to Montgomery that was going to start in the morning. We ran all the way, knowing we were being followed. M044-1245. A Klan motorcade led by Robert Shelton, Imperial Wizard, United Klan of America, in car number 1, and Bob Creel, Grand Dragon of Alabama, in car number 2, consisting of some 240 people in 83 cars decorated with Confederate flags, departed Patterson Field, Madison Avenue, Montgomery, 2:40 p.m. March 21st, 1965. Bureau agents observed this motorcade. Most of the cars were occupied by family groups, well dressed. A few old cars were occupied by men dressed in overalls. Lead cars were observed carrying slogan signs such as "Voting rights, yes. Special attention, no." "Be a man. Join the Klan." And "KKK forever." FBI report to the director, M044-1245.